And we'll allow a little bit of time for more people to come in. All right. I think we are pretty good to start. So let us begin. To start with, we are recording this and it should be live streaming on Facebook as well. Welcome and thank you for joining us for Leading the Way, Texas Trailblazer Oveta Culp Hobby. I'm Tracy Anderson with the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission, and with me tonight is my colleague Lorelei Gonzalez. We're so glad you're spending your evening with us. We know how busy life gets, especially this time of year with spring break around the corner, and how many options you have for things to do. So it really means a lot that you chose us. Tonight, we're excited to highlight someone who represents why designations like Women's History Month are so important in Texas history, and to share more about the work we do at the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission. We are the nonprofit partner of the Texas Historical Commission, and we support historic preservation and education efforts across the state. If you'd like to learn more about us or ways to get involved, visit the What We Do page at thcfriends.org. Again, that's thcfriends.org. Thank you. We want to make a shout out to everyone who's already supported us through our virtual event series. Your generosity makes these programming issues possible. You're here tonight with us, and so we know that you have a passion for preservation and find value in the work that we do. If you haven't already, consider donating in a way that's meaningful for you and become part of our mission and the support that we provide to the THC. Please know how very, very important that is to us. You can also follow us on social media. We'd love to connect with you there. Before we dive in, just a few quick house. Please keep your microphones on mute during the presentation and don't be alarmed if you see us mute any live mics. We will have a Q&A at the end. Feel free to drop your questions in the chat at any point as they occur to you, and we will get to as many of them as we can. For those joining us on Facebook Live, you can leave your questions in the comments and we'll go back and add those in. We are, as I said, being recorded and we will later post this to our YouTube channel. And all of our virtual events are available on our YouTube channel. We will be sending an email to those that have registered. So if you received an email letting you know about this event, you'll get an email letting you know where you can go to our YouTube channel. It's going to include a list of resources, links, book recommendations, whatever we hold onto in chat tonight, we'll include it in that email. And now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Don Carleton. Dr. Carleton is the founding executive director of the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History, and he holds the J.R. Parton Chair in the Archives of American History at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the author of 15 books, including Red Scare, Dolph Briscoe, My Life in Texas Politics and Ranching, Conversations with Cronkite, and most recently, Bill Hobby, A Life in Journalism and Public Service, co-authored with Aaron Purdy. Oveta Culp Hobby's definitive biographer, Dr. Carleton also authored The Governor and the Colonel, a dual biography of William P. Hobby and Oveta Culp Hobby, which was featured in the Texas Book Festival. Dr. Carleton is also the editor of several books, including Behold the People, The Photographs of R.C. Hickman in Black Dallas, and Flash of Light, Wall of Fire, Japanese photographs documenting the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He is the executive producer and historical advisor for 2 PBS documentaries, When I Rise and Cactus Jack, Lone Star on Capitol Hill. Dr. Carleton served as chief researcher and historical advisor for former CBS Newsman and anchor Walter Cronkite's best-selling memoir, A Reporter's Life, and Cronkite's television miniseries Cronkite Remembers. From 1998 until 2008, he conducted dozens of in-depth video oral history interviews with pioneers of broadcast journalism for the Television Academy Foundation in Los Angeles, also known as the Emmys Foundation, including Fess Parker, David Brinkley, Andy Rooney, Ed Bradley, Dan Rather, Barbara Walters, and Jim Lehrer. All are available on YouTube. Dr. Carleton has worked as a historical consultant, lecturer, and researcher in Nicaragua, Australia, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Israel, the Czech Republic, Poland, Romania, and Japan. Everyone, please welcome Dr. Carleton. Let's get started.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and a special thanks to the team, including you guys at the Texas Historical Commission. I appreciate this invitation to speak to this audience. I do want to apologize ahead of time. Maybe some of you share the same problem I do with the pollen count. I'm a little raspy of voice, so if you'll forgive me for that, hopefully it'll be okay. Uh, I'm really excited about being able to do this virtual presentation about the stellar and path-breaking career of Oveta Culp Hobby, who is a native of Killeen, Texas, and who I will take the liberty of calling Oveta throughout my presentation. I don't think, from everything I knew about Oveta, she probably would prefer that I called her Mrs. Hobby, but this is informal, so hopefully that'll work. By the way, I'm often asked about Oveta's first name, which is unusual. Well, the question's not unusual, it's the first name that's unusual. Her mother, Emma Culp, C-U-L-P, gave her that name. And according to family tradition, uh, Emma, her mother, named Oveta for a fictional Cherokee Indian who was a character in a popular romance novel at the time of Oveta's birth. Allegedly, Oveta was the Cherokee word for forget. Now, I looked at every Cherokee dictionary I could find, and I could never find that definition, but that's okay. Well, there's another version actually of where that name came from. And that version is that she was named Oveta because it rhymed with her older sister's name, which was Juanita. So there you have it. Both stories might well be true, actually. So there it is. We do know for certain, however, that Oveta's name was misspelled and mispronounced throughout her long life. Now, let me give you a brief background about my own work to document Oveta's story. I've long had a strong historical interest in Oveta and her husband, William Pettus Hobby, who was the Lieutenant Governor of Texas from 1913 until 1917, and later Governor of Texas from 1917 until 1921. Now, when I say a long interest, I mean going all the way back to my graduate student days more than 50 years ago. My first book, Red Scare, published in 1985, featured an entire chapter on the Hobby's work as owners and publishers of the Houston Post, one of the two major newspapers in Houston for nearly 100 years. The University of Texas Press republished Red Scare in 2016, although I've researched and written several books that focus on other subjects than the Red Scare of the early 1950s. The Hobby's story continued to be linked in small ways to a few of those books as well. About 10 years ago, I turned my full attention back to the Hobbies and eventually published The Governor and the Colonel, a dual biography of Will and Oveta Hobby, who together were one of the most influential couples in Texas history. On her own, Oveta was one of the most important women in the United States during much of the middle years of the 20th century. Now, as I tell you a bit about Oveta's story, you'll understand the reason for the book title, although I think the cover speaks for itself. Which one's the governor and which one's the colonel? That's up to you. I should add that after The Governor and The Colonel was published, I wasn't finished with the hobbies. I continued the family story by writing another book, this time with a gifted co-author, Aaron Purdy. That book, which was published 2 years ago, is a biography of Will and Oveta's son, Bill Hobby, who served as Lieutenant Governor of Texas for 18 years. Until now, there's been no comprehensive biography linking and integrating the lives of Will and Oveta, who we would refer to today as a power couple. Will's early success as a politician and newspaper publisher is critical to an understanding of Oveta Culp Hobby's later success on the national stage. It was Will's financial success that gave Oveta the freedom to excel, although she was his close partner in all of their business and civic activities. It's for that reason I decided to write a dual biography, one that covers more than 100 years of history, and it's based on research in dozens of collections in more than 20 archives and libraries, including the Library of Congress and 5 presidential libraries. Because March is Women's History Month, I'll focus today not on Governor Will, but on Oveta's life and career, a woman who's taken a prominent place in women's history. There's much that I can tell you about Oveta's many accomplishments, but my focus today will be on her path-breaking service during the Second World War. Although time restraints force me to leave out most of Will Hobby's story, I hope my talk will entice you to grab many copies of my book and learn about his story as well. And let me say this, any sales from this book go directly to my center, the Briscoe Center, so it's a good cause, and that's why I can shamelessly promote it. Will was one of the most important governors in Texas history. A few years after Will left public office, his first wife, Willie, died in her sleep at their home in Houston's Montrose neighborhood. At the time, Will was the managing editor of the Houston Post. In 1931, at the age of 53, he married Oveta Culp, a precocious 24-year-old from Killeen. Despite her young age, Oveta, who was the daughter of Ike Culp, a member of the Texas legislature, had already become well known in state political circles by the time of her marriage to Will Hobby. In 1925, when Will was just 20, she was appointed parliamentarian of the Texas House of Representatives. I said in 1925 when Oveta was just 20. I think I said that. So at any rate, she was appointed parliamentarian of the Texas House of Representatives because this was before she was even old enough to vote. After their marriage, Will and Oveta quickly forged an intimate personal and business relationship that eventually led to their ownership of the Houston Post newspaper and Houston's pioneering KPRC radio station. Now, during the 1930s, Oveta became a prominent figure in Houston's civic and social circles while she was editor of the Houston Post. She was active in local and state politics, and she served as a leader of the National American Newspaper Publishers Association, where she was one of only 3 female members. In June 1941, Oveta was attending the annual Newspaper Publishers Conference in Washington, D.C., when the commander of the Public Relations Bureau of the U.S. Army invited her to a meeting at the War Department. and they wanted to get her advice about how to solve a major public relations problem that the Army had. That problem was that the wives, mothers, and girlfriends of military draftees were flooding the department with letters, telegrams, and cards expressing serious worries about the safety and welfare of their loved ones who had been called into the service of the nation by the nation's first peacetime draft. Those concerns varied widely in nature, but they included complaints about the quality and amount of food their men were being served, the kind of medical care they were provided. They were worried about the use of live ammunition in their men's training and accusations of mistreatment by military drill instructors. Oveta, who had also served as an editor of the women's page at the Houston Post, recommended that the Bureau should establish a special unit to handle these public relations issues, a suggestion the Bureau commander eagerly accepted. And of course, as so often happens in these things, the person who recommended the plan, and that was Oveta, was begged to come to Washington to organize and administer it. So after consulting with Will back in Houston, Oveta agreed to accept their offer. This is a photograph of Oveta at the Public Relations Bureau. She was taken, this was a wire service photograph that was taken of her that was spread and distributed all over the United States. So Oveta assumed the position in July 1941 as the head of the Women's Interest Section of the Army. She intended it to be a temporary job that would last only a few months. Oveta was now mother of two small children, and she was reluctant to be away from home for very long. The Army's announcement of Oveta's appointment was widely noted in the nation's press. Stories played up the angle that not only was a woman now holding an important administrative job in the Department of War, which was unique, she also was working on women's issues, not previously perceived to be an area of any concern to the military. Her success in this position soon tossed her into the middle of a battle to create a women's Army Corps. General George C. Marshall, the Army's chief of staff, had advocated for a women's unit as early as the fall of 1939. But powerful members of the Southern congressional delegation strenuously opposed the idea, as did many of the Army's leaders, which kept the proposal from making any progress. The expansion of war in Western Europe and in Asia in 1940 brought new life to the idea, however. Massachusetts Congresswoman Edith Norse Rogers introduced a bill to establish a women's unit in the Army, but it continued to face stiff political opposition. And then we have a slide here of Will Hobby, Oveta Hobby, and Edith Norse, who was the Congresswoman who introduced the bill. However, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 suddenly forced the issue, and the Rogers bill moved through Congress finally. While Congress debated the Rogers bill, General Marshall decided Oveta was his choice to lead the proposed Women's Corps. General Marshall, who had observed Oveta's skillful work while she was in the Public Relations Bureau, was impressed with her intelligence and abilities. And this next slide we have here is of General Marshall in the background and Oveta at a national conference of the leaders of women's organizations, where she was explaining how the Army was solving this problem of the women being worried about their men being drafted into the Army. Marshall asked Oveta to testify to the House Committee on Military Affairs in support of the Rogers Bill. Her brilliant performance in that hearing convinced Marshall that Oveta would be an effective head of his task force to plan a women's unit in the Army, a unit he now believed would finally be a reality. Oveta's success leading the women's interest unit led to Representative Rogers and the Army's personnel section to urge Marshall to appoint Oveta as the WAC commander if and when the Women's Corps bill passed. Marshall needed no convincing. He persuaded Oveta to take a job that did not yet exist. Secretary of War Stimson agreed with Marshall's choice of Oveta, as did President Roosevelt, with strong encouragement from the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, with whom Oveta had established a friendship during the Roosevelt's campaign trips to Austin and Dallas in 1936. The Rogers Bill passed in May 1942. This next slide is of Oveta sitting with House Speaker Texan Sam Rayburn, who worked closely with Oveta when they were lobbying the Congress to pass the WAC bill, the Women's Army Corps bill. After President Roosevelt signed the bill, Secretary of War Stimson announced Oveta's appointment as director of the new Women's Army Auxiliary Corps. And I emphasize the word auxiliary for an important reason. This made Oveta the head of an entirely new corps with only one member, herself. Oveta's position was completely new in U.S. military history. There were no precedents for her to follow, and the initial set of regulations, which were makeshift and hastily written while the Rogers Bill made its way through Congress, had to be thoroughly revised now that the WACs were a reality. And this is a picture of Oveta and her executive officer, one of the first people that she recruited when she became director. And they're at Fort Des Moines in Iowa, which became the first WAC base. The most important problem Oveta faced as she worked to organize the Corps was Congress's decision to make the Corps an auxiliary, which I mentioned early. It was be an auxiliary to the Army, whose members would work for, and when I say members, I'm talking about the new auxiliary Women's Army Corps members, whose members would work for the Army, but would not be officially in the Army. The women would be subject to military rules, regulations, and military discipline, but they were denied military benefits such as insurance and medical services. And if they served near a battlefront, they would not be eligible for extra war zone pay or have the same legal rights as military prisoners of war should they be captured. This problem soon became obvious after the United States invasion of North Africa in November of 1942. The Allied Supreme Commander in Europe, General Dwight Ike Eisenhower, asked for 5 WAC officers who spoke fluent French to be stationed in French Algiers to assist his headquarters with clerical support. Oveta quickly dispatched 5 WAC volunteers to the war zone. A few days after Thanksgiving, a German U-boat torpedoed and sank the ship carrying the WAC officers. The women survived, but the incident dramatically highlighted the lack of protection these women face because they weren't officially members of the Army. Soon after, Ike requested additional WACs for support in North Africa, explaining that they would be sent into, quote, hazardous conditions, unquote, near the battlefront. Oveta expressed strong objections to Ike's request to General Marshall. General Marshall overruled Oveta's protests, but he was sympathetic to her concerns. He even paid for replacement clothing for the five WAC officers out of his own pocket because they weren't eligible for a clothing reimbursement from the Army due to their limbo status. He also arranged for the women to be guests at a dinner hosted at the Casablanca Conference in North Africa, attended by FDR and Winston Churchill, where they were recognized by both Roosevelt and Churchill for their bravery. And from that point forward, George Marshall worked to make the women full members of the regular Army. In 1943, largely because of Marshall's and Oveta's urging, Congress passed a second bill, sponsored again by Congresswoman Rogers, that converted the Women's Auxiliary Corps into a regular division of the U.S. Army with full military benefits. Auxiliary was dropped from the title, which gave the new Army unit a shorter name, the Women's Army Corps, known by the news media and the public as the WACs. This is a picture here now going on of Oveta's official swearing in as a member of the Army. And she's being, the people present include General George Marshall, who is on the left, and General Somerville behind her in the photo. On July 1st, 1943, FDR signed the legislation, and Oveta was sworn in as a member, as I pointed out in this photograph. She was given the rank of colonel. She had had the title of director when the WACs were an auxiliary to the Army. This next picture is of Franklin Roosevelt and Oveta in the back of the presidential limousine when President Roosevelt was touring one of the WAC camps in Georgia. You can see Oveta digging for a cigarette, and the president is smoking his own there. Oveta Culp Hobby quickly became a national celebrity, and stories about her path-breaking role, not only as the first woman in the Army, but also as the first woman colonel. And those stories appeared in newspapers throughout the United States. She also was featured on the cover of Time magazine. And here we have a slide of the cover of Time magazine. This is one of two appearances that Oveta Culp Hobby made on the cover of Time magazine. She would later be on the cover in the 1950s. Despite her newly gained national fame, Oveta continually faced a number of obstacles as commander of the WACs. Senior military officers opposed her actions and proposals at every turn. Most of the Army base commanders made it clear that they had no interest whatsoever in having WACs assigned to their bases, largely because they claimed that the women could not perform the skilled jobs the commanders needed. I'm fairly confident that most of the audience tonight will not be surprised to know that most of the difficulties Oveta faced were sexist in nature, and they were directed at her largely by male military officers, her fellow journalists, and male members of Congress. Oveta's struggles with strong opposition from male Army officers involved nearly every facet of her command. She had battles with the Army in matters both small and large, some of them utterly ludicrous, including, believe it or not, a fight about bras, of all things. The Army brass vigorously opposed issuing bras to the WACs because they claimed bras were a waste of money and material. One high-ranking officer claimed bras were, quote, surgical contraptions, unquote, that rigorous exercise and proper posture would make totally unnecessary. Oveta successfully opposed that ruling, but the bras the Army supplied the women were so badly designed and fabricated that most WACs eventually used their personal money to purchase the bras at department stores. Oviedo also had to fight the Army's decision not to set up hair salons at the WAC bases. She won that argument as well by pointing out that every Army post had a barber shop for the men. Another, more difficult problem arose when the Army decided to grant honorable discharges to married WACs if they became pregnant while in the Corps. They decided, however, and when I say they, I mean the Army, decided that unmarried WACs who became pregnant would be dishonorably discharged for the previously unknown offense of pregnancy without permission, quote unquote. Oveta was simply outraged by that decision, aware of the lifelong double stigma a dishonorable discharge for pregnancy out of wedlock would impose on a woman. In a contentious meeting with Army brass, she argued the regulation not only was unfair, it also was legally untenable. Having attended law school, but withdrawing shortly before she graduated, Oveta argued there was no such thing as an illegal pregnancy, either in military or civilian law. She asked the Army officers if male soldiers who fathered children with women who weren't their wives, if they would also be subject to this regulation. That ended the argument. The officers made a hasty retreat. This next picture is a picture of the wax parading in Manhattan, New York, for a celebration of the third anniversary of the wax in 1945. Note that Oveta, you may not be able to see her, she is a tiny figure in the bottom of the picture in khaki. She's the only one in khaki in a line of men or people, and she's directly in front of a 550-pound cake that was made in honor of the wax. Now, this rampant sexism began to seriously hamper Oveta's recruiting efforts. In response, she submitted a report to General Marshall that detailed the hostile attitudes and actions of Army leadership towards her and other women officers in the military. Oveta's complaint persuaded Marshall to issue a letter to his commanding officers demanding that they honor the dignity and importance of the work of women in the war effort. Marshall's letter, which was perceived accurately by base commanders as an order from the chief of staff, had a positive effect. Oveta also faced sexist behavior from many male members of Congress. For example, at a Senate hearing when she was testifying in support of the creation of the Women's Army Corps, Oveta had to endure the ignorant comments of legislators like South Carolina Senator Cotton Ed Smith, who complained that the creation of the wax would result in disrespect for American, quote, womanhood, unquote, which would surely lead to the downfall of the country. Cotton Ed argued that, quote, this nonsense about how many girdles and brassieres and things the women are going to wear will cause us all to lose our modesty, unquote. Another congressman asked Oveta if women were allowed to join the Army, well, who would remain at home to cook dinner and wash clothes? Sexism even impacted Oveta's Army rank. Although the size of her command more than qualified her to be a general officer, the Southern delegation in Congress rigidly refused to allow her a higher rank than colonel. And it was strictly on the grounds that she was a woman, a reason they openly admitted. Perhaps most surprising to Oveta was the sexism she faced from her fellow journalists. At her first press conference as a WAC commander, Oveta was beset by questions that would never be asked of a man. She was asked what color of underwear the WACs are going to be issued. Would the women be wearing girdles? Are they allowed to put on makeup? How about nail polish and eyelashes? What items do you normally carry in your purse, Colonel Hobby? And news stories about the Women's Corps, journalists often referred to it as the petticoat army. Individual WACs were referred to as wackies and Amazons. Reporters called the WAC training camp at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, Fort Lipstick. When Oveta complained about this, the reporters told her to get a sense of humor. The news media often stressed Oveta's attractive physical appearance, sometimes to an absurd extent. At one point, the Associated Press asked one of its photographers to take a picture of Colonel Hobby in a swimsuit, posing on the diving board of the pool at the WAC officer training camp in Iowa, similar to the widely circulated picture of popular swimming movie star Esther Williams. An Army press officer quickly vetoed the idea with the explanation that there would be, quote, no cheesecake of the boss, unquote. Oveta moved through these challenges using her considerable diplomatic and leadership skills. Her connection to General George Marshall was key to Oveta's ability to maneuver, or at times outmaneuver, the military bureaucracy. Marshall remained Oveta's most steadfast and loyal supporter throughout her tenure as commander of the WACs. Another one of Oveta's influential relationships was with Eleanor Roosevelt. The First Lady helped Oveta from the beginning of her military service when she led the women's interest section in the PR Bureau. This is a photograph of Oveta and Eleanor Roosevelt in England. In 1942, Eleanor invited Oveta to fly with her on a seaplane to the United Kingdom on a dangerous trip across the North Atlantic for an important 3-week visit to boost U.S. relations with the British. Oveta's task was to evaluate the effectiveness of the British version of the WACs. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth staged a grand official welcome to Eleanor and Oveta when they arrived by train in London. It was on that occasion that Oveta met General Ike Eisenhower, who invited her to lunch at the Dorchester Hotel. As they entered the restaurant, Oveta surprised Ike by stepping aside and letting him enter first because he outranked her. Unaccustomed to entering a room ahead of his female guests, Ike howled with laughter and declared that, quote, where he came from, a lady was a lady and ladies came first, unquote. Ike's unassuming style and humor soon endeared him to Oveta, a feeling that was mutual. Afterward, Oveta visited military bases in England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland to observe the UK's version of the WACs. It was apparent to her that the British women were making an important contribution to their nation's military struggle, the kind of contribution she believed American women could make to the U.S. war effort. While in England, Ike and Oveta attended a formal dinner hosted by the American ambassador to the UK, John Winnett. It was an English tradition that no one could smoke at a formal dinner until the host had made a toast to the king. Ike, who knew Oveta was a heavy smoker, assumed she was badly in need of a cigarette. Ike, who also smoked, shared Oveta's distress. Tired of waiting, I called out at the dinner, "Mr. Ambassador, when are we going to toast the king?" Without waiting for an answer, Ike reached in his pocket and tossed a pack of Lucky Strikes into Oveta's lap. The toast was immediately made. During the long flight over to the UK, the air crew initiated Oveta into the Short Snorter Club. What a name. The initiation, initiation was a ritual in which flight crews and their passengers, while in the air above the Atlantic, signed dollar bills called short snorters, which conveyed good luck to soldiers crossing the Atlantic. Signing these dollar bills initiated the passengers into the Short Snorters Club, which required them to carry the signed dollar bill with them at all times. When another member of the club asked if he or she was in the club, and they replied yes, they were required either to produce their signed dollar bill as proof, or they had to buy every short snorter present a drink and pay them $1. During a dinner at Oveta's hotel with several other guests, Ike looked at Oveta and called out loudly, "Are you a short snorter?" Oveta answered, "Yes, of course," before realizing that she had left her signed dollar bill in her hotel room upstairs. Ike gleefully told her it was going to cost her several dollars if she didn't quickly produce the signed dollar bill. Oveta leaped up and raced out of the dining room to the elevator and up to her room. She got the bill and returned to the dining room just before her time limit expired, much to Ike's great delight. From this point on, Ike and Oveta maintained a deep and respectful friendship that would ultimately have a significant bearing on Ike's nomination for the presidency in 1952. That friendship would last until Ike's death in 1969. Several years after the war ended, Ike sent a letter to Oveta stating that she was the person who convinced him that organizing the WACs would be a valuable help to the war effort. Quote from Eisenhower, he said, "I must say, Oveta, it proved itself under your leadership to be one of the finest organizations the Army has ever had," unquote. Now, due to health issues caused by a thyroid condition made worse by the stress of her overwhelming workload, Oveta resigned her position in June 1945, a month after VE Day, although the war continued in the Pacific. She left the WACs as a fully functional and vital unit that the Army realized it could not do without. The WACs itself would continue as a unit until the Army integrated women into its regular organization and disbanded the Corps. When she returned to Houston, Oveta reassumed her position as publisher of the Houston Post and co-owner with her husband of KPRC Radio. In 1950, the couple added KPRC television to their media holdings. It was one of the first television stations in Texas. This next picture is of Oveta and President Eisenhower in the 1950s. And you can see from the picture that they were very comfortable with each other. After the war, when Ike ran for president as the Republican candidate in the 1952 presidential campaign, Oveta served as the activist leader of the National Democrats for Eisenhower organization, and she was an active participant in the campaign and served as an advisor on women's issues. After his election to the presidency, Ike appointed Oveta as the secretary of the newly established Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, known as HEW, which made her only the second woman in U.S. history to serve on a presidential cabinet. Other than organizing the massive new federal department, one of Oveta's major accomplishments as Secretary of HEW was her skilled administration of the successful development of the Salk vaccine during the polio epidemic. Soon after the polio vaccine was announced, Oveta resigned as HEW secretary and returned to Houston because of Will Hobby's increasingly poor health, and making it necessary for Oveta to take full control of their business enterprises. When Will died in 1964, the city of Houston named its municipal airport in his honor. We have Hobby Airport today, still with us. Oveta continued as the head of the Houston Post and the Hobby family's media holdings until eventually selling the newspaper in 1983 and KPRC radio and television in 1994. Oveta lived for 31 years after her husband's death. During most of those years, she continued her deep involvement in public service. For example, during LBJ's presidency, Oveta accepted appointments for service on several of his important task forces, including one that sent her to Vietnam in the middle of the war, and another that led to the creation of PBS and NPR. She and the Johnson family were very close friends and had known each other for many years. She died in 1995 at the age of 90. Of all of Oveta's accomplishments throughout her long life, she will likely be best remembered for her service during World War II. She organized every aspect of the Corps, literally from scratch, and in the face of all opposition, eventually enlisted more than 150,000 women who served in every theater of the war. At one point, the WACs filled 155 different types of non-combat jobs, ranging from stenographers and translators to chemists and surgical technicians to welders and mechanics. This next picture shows Secretary of War Stimson presenting Oveta with the Distinguished Service Medal. She received this after she resigned as the WAC commanding officer. Eleanor Roosevelt issued a statement when Oveta left the WAC command. Quote, "How well Oveta Culp Hobby handled the job may be attested by the fact that we now have women in every branch of our military services, in uniform, receiving the same pay, and rating as the men, performing almost every type of duty except combat. A great deal of the credit for that goes to her," unquote. As I said, in recognition of her outstanding performance, she was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal. She was the first woman in history to be so honored. In 2011, the U.S. Postal Service issued a stamp in Oveta Culp Hobby's honor. The portrait of Oveta on the stamp depicts her in her WAC uniform. Oveta's contributions to the war effort were so significant that she is the only woman who is quoted on the World War II memorial on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Her quote joined those of Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur, and Fredericksburg, Texas native son, I should say, Admiral Chester Nimitz. And this is the quote that is on the World War II memorial. And those of you who have not seen it before, I hope you see it in the future. And the quote is this: "Women who stepped up were measured as citizens of the nation, not as women. This was a people's war, and everyone was in it," unquote. Thank you, and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
We do have a few questions, and please, people that are listening in can just drop those in the chat box If you are viewing this on Facebook, drop a question in the comments and we'll get over to it as quickly as we can. Our first question is from Rowena, who is a board member of the Friends, and she's asking, how did that ramp up happen? She's specifically thinking about the logistics, including uniforms, providing housing, all in a world that had previously totally focused on mail service.
Well, I mean, if I understand the question correctly, I mean, it was really, Oveta was a workaholic. She was obviously a younger woman at that time, and she just was full of energy. And she was I mean, she attended to all the details. I've gone through all of her papers. She has all of her WAC papers are at the, in Washington, the National Archives. And it's amazing all the stuff that she was involved in, and she had her hands and fingers and everything. And how she did it, is just basically great skill and intelligence and energy, the combination of all three. And she did eventually, through all these battles with the Army brass, you could almost say it was the Battle of WAC. But at any rate, she did win over a number of the main opposition she had in the Army because the wax proved to be so valuable to these commanders that every one of them, by the time she was leaving, wanted a WAC contingent at their base. I don't know if is, Rowena, if that answers your question or not, but I'm glad to see that you're here with us.
Thank you, Dr. Carleton. Ray Lynn Tipping says, I've heard of the hobbies practically all of my life, but I'm a lifelong Texan and I see things from that insider's perspective. Bill was lieutenant governor during her school years, and she did meet him once at the Capitol. Can you share what kind of knowledge present day non Texans might have of Oveta and the Hobby family?
Well, I could answer that as a historian, a professional historian, and that is, as I told my students when I was teaching, that people disappear, they get lost to history. It doesn't matter how famous they are. You can count practically on your two hands the names of people like Lincoln and Washington and Thomas Jefferson in American history, of course. But there are so many people who have made this country who are literally, in some ways, lost to history. That just seems to be a natural phenomenon. And it's sad, but it's one of the reasons that historians write books because we try to recover these people who are lost to history. A good example, the introduction said that I was the executive producer of a documentary about the life of Cactus Jack Garner. John Nance Garner, who was the first Texan to be Speaker of the House of Representatives in Congress. He was the first Texan to be Vice President of the United States and served 2 terms under Franklin Roosevelt. He's essentially was lost to history as well. And we run a museum in Uvalde that is a museum dedicated to John Nance Garner and also to Dolph Briscoe, who was also from Uvalde.
Thank you. Deborah would like to know how the women were recruited to join the WACs.
They used the Oveta used the model of the Army and Navy, and they had recruiters stationed throughout the country. And they just basically they just followed that model and literally would have a WAC or a recruiter in some central place. Sometimes at the same place where soldiers were, I mean, where men were being recruited. And it was a tough road to hoe, frankly, at the beginning, again, because of all of the sexism and there. But she finally got her rolling, as you could see. And there were 150,000 women eventually signed up.
So that brings us to a question that Donna Jean Selquist would like to know. She see, excuse me, she saw that there were some Black women in that New York City parade photo in 1945 and
Yes.
would like to know, was she a leader in integrating those forces?
She was, and there's an interesting story. There's a movie out, in fact, about one of the contingent of black women who were sent to London. They were requested by Ike Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, and there's a little story that goes along with that that I'll try to tell quickly. It's an interesting one because it tells you something about Oveta's fierceness. Because she and Eisenhower became very close friends even while Eisenhower, long before he became president. And Eisenhower requested this contingent of wax, and so NAACP, Urban League, and several of the civil rights organizations were asking her and urging her to send a contingent. Of course, unfortunately, the Army remained racially segregated, so the contingents were divided by race. But they really wanted her to send a contingent of black women, members of the WACS, to Europe. And she did. She sent them to England, to London. And while they were there, she got a letter or a communication from General Eisenhower uh, saying that permission for these black women to be escorts for black soldiers in England uh, and because the English, some people in England, were complaining that black soldiers were dating white women in England. And Eisenhower thought a solution to that would be to have black WAC members come over and date the black soldiers over there. Well, Oveta, when she got the memo and I found the papers, went nuts. She just absolutely went through the roof. And she sent this to her friend, General Eisenhower. She sent this communication saying that WACs were not recruited to be escorts for American soldiers and that she was going to put a stop to that, and she did not permit it. And Eisenhower quickly apologized. And that was the end of it. The contingent of black wax that she sent to London were a postal contingent, by the way. They handled the post office for the army in England.
Netflix recently had a movie about that I have not watched yet. Interesting. Okay.
I encourage you to do that.
Yeah. Lorelei, our own Lorelei, was curious about how many years in total did Oveta serve in the military with the wax and the auxiliary.
Well, she came on, she went in there before the war to do this public relations bureau. She thought that was going to be it. And then, of course, the attack on Pearl Harbor, December the 7th. She was actually uh, going home. She was in the airport in Chicago going back to Houston. When she got off the airplane is when she heard the news about Pearl Harbor. And she immediately got on the phone and called her husband and said that she was going back to Washington because she thought she might be needed in some way. And so she returned to Washington. And then she, was pulled into the story that I just told you about of being involved in the formation of the Women's Army Corps. But she was in Washington really for a period of 5 years, 5 solid years if you count the period of time that she was at the Public Relations Bureau as well.
And her children were young at the time, you said?
Yes, they were. Bill Hobby, for example, was born in 1932. So when she went to Washington, he was 8. Now, she was fortunate. She had the great luck, or good fortune, I guess, that Will had made quite a bit of money as the owner of, well, they were jointly owned, of the Houston Post and the KPRC radio. So they did have the luxury of having a nanny
Right.
as well. And they eventually moved, they transferred Bill Hobby, her son, to college, excuse me, a boarding school in Washington, D.C., where Oveta could come and be with him during the war.
So did not see any questions on the Facebook live stream, but does anyone else have any questions for Don Carleton about Oveta Culp Hobby? I don't see any. Well, we want to thank you all for joining us this evening. And give a big thank you to Dr. Carleton and the staff at the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History who made tonight possible. Again, follow us on social media. We have YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram. The links are in the chat. Good night, all of us, here at the Friends of the Texas Historical Commission.
Thank you very
Have a
much.
good evening.
Thank you.